Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is a webinar as part of the UNESCO-UNEVOC virtual conference on entrepreneurial learning, and it's part of topic 3, entrepreneurial curriculum in entrepreneurial learning in the curriculum in TVeT. And we're delighted to welcome Martin Lackéus from Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden. And he is a researcher, academic, but also an entrepreneurship education practitioner and an entrepreneur. So he's going to be talking to us about value creation pedagogy and how entrepreneurial learning can be part of this, support it, and can drive it. So I would like to hand over, without further ado, to Martin. Thank you so much for joining us, Martin, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. So I'm Martin Lackéus, and I won't say so much more about me. Let's talk about this topic here: value creation pedagogy. This is the research I've been doing for the last 8-9 years, and it comes from entrepreneurial pedagogy. It springs out of that, and I will talk more about the relation between entrepreneurship and value creation pedagogy later on in the presentation. I work a lot with vocational education in Sweden because when you work with value creation in education, there is one type of education that does this better than any other, I would say, and that's vocational education, technical or not. So I prepared a small agenda. I have maybe 20-25 minutes, so I'm going to be quite brief on every topic here. First, I'm going to talk about what is value creation pedagogy, and the short version is that it's learning through creating value for others. Then I'm going to talk about why is this a good idea, and the short version there is that it's because it's about motivation, it's about variation in pedagogy, it's about the social climate for learning, and it's also about entrepreneurial skills. Then shortly, a short part about how to do value creation pedagogy with some practical tools and methods. That applies maybe more to traditional education than to vocational education. But vocational education can also be traditional, so maybe it applies as well. The last part is maybe the most interesting for this conference, and that's where TVeT and value creation pedagogy meet. How does value creation pedagogy relate to TVeT? And there I will try to spend 10 minutes and tell you a little bit about what I've been up to in the last couple of years and what insights we have from that work. That's about it, so I'm going to get started. But before we take the first part, we have to take part 0, context. What is value? Because when we talk about value creation pedagogy, we need to have a clear understanding of what do we mean by the word value. And normally in entrepreneurship, value is about economic value for oneself. That's what people assume, at least. But there are many other perspectives on value. You can create enjoyment value, you can create social value, harmony value, you can create influence value, and you can create it not only for yourself, but also for others. And in fact, I think a better starting point in education is for students to create value to others rather than to themselves, because that's what we focus on every day anyhow. And also when we talk about entrepreneurship, there are many different definitional aspects of entrepreneurship. Here's a definitional prism where entrepreneurship can be viewed in at least 7 different ways. It can be viewed as about innovation, about the traits of the successful entrepreneurs. It can be viewed as being about organization creation. It can be about creating new value. It can be about working with opportunities. It can be about competencies that one can learn. And it can be about methods, entrepreneurial methods. I don't talk much about entrepreneurship. I talk more about being entrepreneurial. And then a number of these definitions actually need to be, if not completely disappear, at least being toned down a lot, especially organization creation. So my perspective on what it means to be entrepreneurial is about creating value, learning competencies, and using entrepreneurial methods. So that's also something to keep in mind when we go into the first part, what is value creation pedagogy? So a short definition of value creation pedagogy contains 6 words. Learning through creating value for others. A longer version goes a bit like this. Let students learn by applying their existing and future competencies to create something, preferably novel, of value to at least one external stakeholder outside their group, class, or school. And this definition was the result of a number of years of research on this. What is it that we are talking about? And it might need a revision in the future as well, but it holds so far. In the bottom of each slide, you see some references. That's where you can go and get much more in-depth information about each of the aspects that I talk about. I will not be so research focused today, so anyone who wants to go more into research, have a look at the references. I'll show you some of the examples here that we have been looking at when it comes to articulating value creation pedagogy. Because we have not been looking at so much students starting companies, because that's the obvious example, and we wanted to go beyond that. So we've been looking at children helping architects to design a new building. These kids are only 4 years old. Creating companies is not really an alternative for pedagogy there. We've been looking at students lobbying in national media to save a TV program for kids. And the image there is actually from a national TV program in Sweden, a debate program, where they go and debate with these adult people who wanted to quit this TV program. Then we've been looking at students teaching elderly how to use iPads, students using waste materials to craft toys for orphan children in Istanbul, in Turkey. We've been looking at students broadcasting their own radio show in the local radio. And we've been looking at students writing music to texts written by younger students. So as you can see, the variety of the examples that we've been looking at is very, very broad. And what we can see here is something of a paradox. I often call it an altruistic paradox, because it seems that we humans get more motivated by creating value for others in 10 minutes than by creating value for ourselves in 10 years. And if that is so, maybe it's better to ask students, for whom is this knowledge valuable today, instead of saying to them, you will have use for this in your future life. I'm going to show you a little video now, illustrating what I think being entrepreneurial is all about. Almost now. First, I'm going to talk about these 2 definitional questions. So what are we talking about when we are talking about learning through creating value for others? Well, as teachers, we can ask ourselves these 2 questions. Question 1, are my students expected to interact with someone outside their own group, teacher, class, or school? It's a yes/no question. And the second question, are my students expected to try to create something of value for someone outside their own group, teacher, class, or school? And if the answer is yes on both of these questions, I would say it's an example of value creation pedagogy. And everyone working in vocational education would probably quite readily be able to answer yes to both of these questions. And that's why I think this is such a vocational education and training is such an interesting type of education, because we have this in its most full and most fantastic form. And I think that that kind of education should be, the role model for all types of education in society, which it currently is not. So now comes the video. So what we're talking about here is that in education, we have a lot of focus on learning, but not so much focus on value creation. And in business or work life in general, we have a lot of focus on creating value for customers and so on, but not much focus on learning. And what I think being entrepreneurial is about is when you have balance, a good balance between learning and value creation. That is when you are entrepreneurial. So my take on, entrepreneurial learning in VET would be to say that, all VET is entrepreneurial. That's when I take this very broad interpretation of what being entrepreneurial means, if you see what I mean. So, why should we work with value creation pedagogy then? and maybe this will resonate with many people in this area. There are 4 challenges that many teachers grapple with. How do I get my students motivated given the tight curriculum plan? How do I achieve sustainable pedagogical variation so that my teaching fits all students? And the third issue, how do I manage everyday classroom conflict in a better way? Maybe an issue primarily in the ages of 10 to 15 years old. I don't know, you tell me. But for some teachers, this is a very important challenge. And then, how do I teach those entrepreneurial skills that are stated to be crucial nowadays? So I think that all of these 4 challenges are addressed by value creation pedagogy, because what the research we have done empirically, and that's a lot of research, we have been looking into a lot of different environments. What we can see consistently is that when students get to create value for others, it gives a strong boost to student motivation, and that makes students work harder. It also clarifies and simplifies pedagogical variation so that the teaching can fit all students. When should I be in the classroom? When should we be outside and be out in the world outside school? When should we be creative? When should we actually read theory, and so on? When it comes to conflict, we've seen that value creation pedagogy reduces the prevalence of classroom conflict so that students collaborate better. Because if you're doing something for real, it's actually important what you're doing. You're not going to mess up in the same way as if you're doing meaningless stuff in school, which from many students' perspective, school is meaningless. Not for us as adults, we know that school is important, but many students think that school is absolutely meaningless. And the 4th aspect is that what we also see is that when you work with value creation pedagogy, it helps teachers in developing their students' entrepreneurial skills so that students fare better in life. So we have a number of good reasons for working in this way. Here is a model that I've been doing in my research that basically shows how entrepreneurial skills are developed. So when teachers do entrepreneurial education activities, such as creation activities, value creation activities, or entrepreneurship, organization creation, and so on, that triggers emotional learning events for their students. They get to interact with the outside world, they get to create value for others, they get to experience uncertainty, teamwork, overcoming competency gaps, getting feedback, very powerful feedback on their own performance. It's these learning events, emotional learning events, that in turn develop their own entrepreneurial competencies. When they have experiences of this kind, they improve their entrepreneurial self-efficacy. They start to feel entrepreneurial passion or even identify themselves as entrepreneurial. They increase their uncertainty tolerance, their self-insight, perseverance, proactiveness, and opportunity skills. So that's basically how it works. It's the emotions that do the trick. So how to do value creation pedagogy? I mean, if you are working with VET, that might not be such a difficult question, but if you have a more theoretical education or more traditional, these are 2 questions that you can ask yourself. And I would say, don't transform your teaching, try to tweak it. How can I add a grain of interaction with external people by doing minor tweaks to my existing student assignments? In vocational education, I mean, there are so many different ways that you can tweak your education, because you have this very practical vocational environment to direct such tweaks to. And the second question, how can the energy my students already spend in school create some value for external people by me doing minor tweaks to my existing student assignments? And if teachers ask themselves these questions repeatedly, and if they act upon the answers, that will lead to a culture of students always asking you upfront, for whom are we doing this? And that's a very liberating question for all people involved. What we see is that teachers actually, they think it's more fun to be a teacher when they work this way. You can also use entrepreneurial methods. I mean, the first question we've already talked about. For whom could this knowledge be valuable today? That's an obvious question. But we can also look at some principles taken from entrepreneurship methods, such as effectuation, appreciative inquiry, design thinking, lean principles. And then we get some questions. For example, what effects can we create with who we are, what we care for, what we have, what we know, and who we know? And what works really well, and how can we get more of that? How can we know what people need? Let's go out and ask them what they need. And how can we know what's valuable? Let's make a prototype. Let's test the prototype. Simple questions coming from the field of entrepreneurship, applicable in education. We've also done a spider diagram that is kind of a checklist for teachers with 8 aspects to consider in value creation pedagogy. And I mean, the first 2 dimensions are the one on the horizontal axis. My students get to interact with external people. To what extent do they get to do that? To what extent do my students get to create value for others? But then you can also ask yourself a number of other questions. To what extent do they get to manage uncertainty and change? To feel ownership of a process and take ownership over resources? To what extent do they get to work in teams? To learn from feedback, work iteratively, and expand their knowledge base? So then, if you answer these questions, you will get a profile on any particular assignment, and that then helps you to see where can I improve. In this example for here, this teacher could then improve on the feedback issue and on the external interaction issue. So if we look upon how teachers have applied value creation pedagogy, we see a number of things that they have been doing. They have been working with value creation pedagogy as activism, to lobby for or be the change that you want to see in society. What change do these students want to see? Let them be that change. We've seen VCP as a profession, and I think it's the strongest connection to vocational education and training, because I mean, vocational education is often, profession-based education, you could say. But there are other ways. You can see VCP as helping ordinary people, disadvantaged people, other people in school. How can your knowledge and your competences help people? It can be a way to work with career guidance, to try out different roles and professions in real life. It can be something to do in one subject or across subjects. How do you get math, language, and humanities and arts and stuff into vocational aspects? This could be an opportunity. And we've seen that this works on all different ages. It works in preschool, it works in primary, secondary, higher, further education, any type of education. We see that this works. And it can also contribute to situations where students have diagnoses of different kinds, autism, ADHD, and so on. So let's look a little bit more about VCP and professions. What about VET and value creation pedagogy? And I'm going to start with a picture, basically just showing the situation of VET. And the first part to the left is that, I mean, in vocational education, you have some paradigmatic challenges. Education and work life are 2 worlds apart. They have different cultures, they have different terms, they have different language, they have different tools, patterns, means, processes, and ends. I mean, that cooks down to learning and value creation. They are like oil and water. You have to mix them if you want to get a really good education, and if you leave them be, they will actually separate, just like oil and water separate. Whenever you've stopped mixing oil and water, they separate spontaneously. Learning and value creation don't want to be in the same liquid, you could say. So these challenges are paradigmatic. We are talking about fundamental differences on a cultural level, ways of thinking, ways of measuring what is good, and this triggers mutual misunderstandings. That is a key challenge. If we then want to improve vocational education, we need to look upon what is going on in the core. So quality in VET starts and ends with the everyday collaboration between 3 parties. It's the supervisor, it's the teacher, and it's the student. What are they doing together? How are they working together? And this is where we need to overcome the paradigmatic challenges. And we have, there is some research on how to overcome paradigmatic challenges. And what has been proposed is that we need to focus on the everyday doing and the empirical facts that all can agree upon. And I mean, I've been involved in working with IT tools, aiming to improve the efficiency of VET. And what we can see is that it can only work if these IT tools facilitate the mixing and the balancing between learning and value creation. So this balance is absolutely crucial for VET. When you have a goal conflict, which you have in VET, one's means is the other's ends. That requires respectful striving for balance between all the parties involved. And that is achieved through give and take. It's achieved when all parties get paid for their efforts and no one is exploited by the other. And there also needs to be a cultural balance in place. For example, if we have one party that single-handedly decides on language, terms, processes, measures, tools, and ends, that's not balance. That's not going to make vocational education work well. So that's, I mean, we often see, for example, in education that we have these regulatory documents that prescribe words and terms that everybody needs to work towards. And then the people in work life say, oh, I don't understand that language. That's not balance. And then the final part, we have to measure. When paradigmatic challenges are a situation that you have, you need to measure what happens in the core of education or education and work life. That's particularly important. That's one way to maintain balance. What's needed is clarity, transparency, and systematic work processes. And this is something that IT can facilitate. So, but then we also have to have a credible scientific empirical method, because honestly, most IT solutions are not based on, you know, a scientific method of collecting data or measuring. It's perhaps an engineer or an IT company that, you know, has done it in a way that they thought was useful, and it doesn't end up so well. So we need IT support that can facilitate measuring what happens in VET. That's one way to improve VET, but only if these solutions are easy to use, and if they can be used by the people in the core of VET, and if these systems contribute to balance the collaboration. So I've been part of building a tool for this that's called LoopMe, and you can read more about this IT tool on loopme.io. And I will not talk much about it, but because I mean, we're soon going to go into discussion here. But what I can say is that this started out as a tool to improve entrepreneurial education, you know, when you start companies and stuff like that. But it ended up being a tool that has been taken to the heart by people in vocational education and training in Sweden primarily, also in some other countries, but primarily in Sweden. And we have just been following, and it's been amazing to see what's going on and what happens. And what we've been able to articulate here through that work that started with entrepreneurial education and ended up in vocational education, since vocational education is, you know, by definition entrepreneurial, we ended up being able to articulate a vision for high quality VET through digitalization. And I mean, it can be with this tool LoopMe, or it can be with any other suitable digital tool. It doesn't have to be LoopMe. LoopMe started out as a research tool that ended up being useful in practice, but there are probably other tools out there. So what you need to do in order to act upon this vision is that you need to work with a core, the core of vocational education and training, the collaboration between supervisor, teaching, and student. And you need to improve the swiftness of what's going on in that core. Communication, feedback, theory, practice, mix, and so on, to make that easier. That in turn then increases visibility. It improves the collaboration. The coordination between the parties. It systematizes the work, and it provides with a new semantic way of discussing what is going on in vocational education. And this then in turn improves the collaboration on a higher level between educator and employers. And it also becomes a basis for working with systematic quality assurance for schools primarily, but maybe also for organizations, companies. And this vision leans on these 4 basic fundamental challenges and characteristics of vocational education. Paradigmatic challenges, the core being crucial, balance being necessary, and measuring being a must. So to finish off, I would say, besides saying that vocational education is by definition entrepreneurial, I would say that if you want to increase the ambition in vocational education in terms of entrepreneurial characteristics, maybe you need to go beyond learning and value for others. And so that is the professional axis of entrepreneurship. 90% of what you do in entrepreneurship is about learning to create value for others. What is valuable? Learning things like that. But there are also 2 other dimensions that need to be taken into account here, and that is agency, personal agency, and novelty. So I would say that if you want to make vocational education even more entrepreneurial, you need to think about what new value can my students provide to some user, customer, or whoever, and how can they get personal ownership into that process. It's them creating this new value. Maybe if they come up with the idea, or if they can own the process. It's not the supervisor at the company saying this is what you should do, this is the value you should create. That is maybe not so entrepreneurial compared to having also agency and novelty into the game here. I wasn't going to show this video, but let's do that anyhow and see if it works. It's about 2 minutes long, and if it doesn't work, I have a link where you can watch it for yourself. Let's see. Okay, so if that video didn't work, you can go to this link, or you can search on YouTube with the 3 words, Being Entrepreneurial Lackéus. And yeah, it's about 2 minutes long. So yeah, that's about it. You can read more about my research on vcplist.com, and you can read more about LoopMe at loopme.io. And you can reach me on the email martin.lackéus@chalmers.se. That's it. Thank you. So time for a discussion, I guess.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Martin. That's been really interesting. Great presentation on learning through creating value for others. And as you say, something that can be applied to technical vocational education and training, definitely, and is in Sweden already, and may well be in other areas of the world. Perhaps it's something that is happening that's just not recognized perhaps as such, or is recognized as such, and we don't know about it yet, which would be great to know if it's already out there. Now, I'd like to open up to questions. We've got some participants here. Any questions on what Martin has shared this morning as through this value creation pedagogy, learning through creating value for others, students learning through a process, through a learning experience where they create value for others outside their group, outside their classroom, or outside their school for an external stakeholder? We're going to be having the questions coming through. If you can come through on the conversation, or if you want to speak, we can also open up your microphone, or you can open up your microphone as well. So please feel free to do that. Perhaps I can open the questions. You spoke about agency, and it's a phrase that sometimes can be misunderstood. It's not always clear what we mean by agency. And I wondered if you can just explain a little bit about what you see as agency. And then we've got some other questions coming through after that.
Yeah, that's not an easy question. That's more or less where we are in our research now. And there's agency and there is entrepreneurial agency. And is there a difference? To me, agency is about something that you do. It could be on behalf of someone else, but you are doing it. But the more that you own that process, the more I would say that you could feel agency. So agency can be something that you feel. You can have high or low agency in what you do. And I would say that the highest possible agency would then be when you really, really own the process. I mean, that is entrepreneurship. You started the company, you own the process completely, you even own the company, you decide everything. Still, I mean, you have to have customers, and they decide what they think is valuable, but you own the process. That is an example of a very high agency. So if you just do what you're being told, maybe you have rather low agency. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
So perhaps we spoke with Colin Jones this morning. He mentioned sort of the student influence on the learning process and experience. So it's increasing levels of student influence on their own learning path, if you like, through to that high level of agency where it's that owned process. Thank you very much. Maria has come through saying that she would like to understand the diamond model in more detail, and that would be great. Feel free to perhaps go back to your slide if that's possible, just so we can see it.
Yeah, let me share that again. Then I'll share it again, and this model, this diamond model, and it basically. It's connected to this prism of different definitions of entrepreneurship. Because what this diamond model was created in our research group as a response to the fuzziness of a broad interpretation of being entrepreneurial. Everybody talks about being entrepreneurial, but what do they actually mean? So what we felt was necessary here was to have a simple model that can be understood, that really explains what being entrepreneurial is about. Because in Sweden we have teachers who say, "Oh, we went outside and had class. Isn't that entrepreneurial?" And I would say, no, it's not. It might be really good, it might be really nice for everyone involved, but I wouldn't say that it's entrepreneurial. So why would that not be entrepreneurial? Well, if we look at the definition, the diamond model, I would say, yeah, they learn, maybe they feel agency, and maybe it was novel to go outside if nobody else is doing that in that school. but have they created something of value for others? Have the students done that by going outside? No, they haven't. So I would say it's not entrepreneurial. So we wanted to have a model that really, it's 4 required dimensions of something in order for it to be entrepreneurial. And then, of course, it's a gray zone, because novelty can be novel for oneself, and it can be novel for the world, and it can be anything in between. Novel for your community, or novel for your family, or something like that. So we wanted to, and we also wanted to put more emphasis on learning. Learning is kind of, I think, it's the neglected part of being entrepreneurial. If you have a business owner who doesn't learn, I would say that person is no longer an entrepreneur. It's a business owner. It's a small business manager who is managing a business that is doing the same thing that as he or she has been doing for, weeks, months, years, or whatever. But when you have learning, that is when you can create new kinds of value. So without learning, I would say we are not talking about entrepreneurship. Without novelty, it's the same. Without agency, it's the same. And without value for others, it's the same. So, I mean, I think we did capture 4 key aspects of what it means to be entrepreneurial. But we also need to have balance between them. So that's why I bought this little, it's a labyrinth game that I bought this summer to do this video, to really show how it's easy to end up in imbalance. You end up creating a lot of value for others, but you don't learn, and it's not novel. Then you have, work life. People create value for others all the time in work life, without learning, without doing something new. And then you have education where, they learn a lot of new things, but they never create value for others, and they don't feel agency. They are just being fed, basically. And that's not entrepreneurial. It could be education. It's certainly necessary at times, but I wouldn't say that it's not entrepreneurial. So this becomes then a test, if you take any technical, vocational, educational training, and you apply this model to it, and you say, are we being entrepreneurial? Well, just go through these 4 dimensions and see how entrepreneurial you are. If there is one of them that is clearly absolutely not the answer, the answer is no, then I would say maybe you can improve if you want to be more entrepreneurial. I don't know, am I making sense here? I'm just
Yes,
along.
You're making sense, certainly. I think that I know that one of the pre-recorded presentations from Caio Flavia Stitina in Brazil illustrated a value creation activity, I feel, that where his students go out in teams to non-governmental organizations and research, work with them to see what value they can create for that organization in any different way that they can. And that's a very interesting sort of practical entrepreneurial learning experience. I wonder, that's in a vocational management course. Sometimes people say it's very difficult to imagine this in some of the more occupational courses in vocational education and training. Have you got any examples that you've seen of value, learning through creating value for others, students learning through creating value for others in particular courses, perhaps occupational courses, that we can illustrate this?
Vocational courses are by definition including a dimension of creating value for others, because they are out. If you're learning to become a carpenter, a very common thing to do is that you build a small house. At least in Sweden, we call this. We have this regulation that anyone can build a house of 15 square meters without even asking for permission from the state. And so when you learn to become a carpenter, most carpenters, student carpenters, they build a house like that for someone who wants a house like that. It's simple. It's not so difficult. And then I would say, okay, that is creating value for others. It's learning through creating value for others. But it's maybe what I would add to that process is to say, okay, how can that process have more agency for the student? Can the student decide who gets this house? Then you get some more agency. Can the student decide that, I don't want to build the usual typical house that looks like every other house that has been built of this kind? I want to do something new. Then we are pushing the ambition in terms of being entrepreneurial. But in general, a lot of occupationally oriented education is already learning through creating value for others. So I mean, that's why I've ended up working so much with them, because I mean they are doing everything that I think should be part of education, and it's so much easier when it's occupationally connected. But I mean, so the difficult part is if it's a very theoretical course or a program. That's when it becomes more tricky. But on the other hand, if you have a very occupationally oriented education, then you could improve your education in other dimensions, such as agency, such as novelty, and so on. Yeah, so I have some more questions coming in here. Example of a lesson plan. I mean, there is a very simple lesson plan you can follow, basically saying that the first 10 minutes you give a basic outline of value creation pedagogy, and then for the next 10 minutes you ask your students to do a little inventory of themselves. It's an effectuation inventory. I can show you. Basically, they ask themselves the questions here. You know, who are we? What can we do? What do we know? Who do we know? And so on. What effects can we create with who we are? That's in the next 10 minutes, and then they get to brainstorm a little bit about that in small groups, and then you ask them, okay, so what we know and who we are, for whom could this be valuable today? So in the next 10 minutes, they get to think about that. And then in the last 10 minutes, they get to tell each other what kind of value they would want to create for someone else based on who they are, what they know. So in 40 minutes, you basically had the first idea stage of trying to come up with ways to create value for others. But I mean, value is not created in a 40-minute session. You need to go out there and you need to give them weeks, maybe even months, to actually try to create that value. So such a lesson plan is just a start of the process. So that could be one way to start a process. Examples of learning outcomes. I mean, I think that we were touching upon this in this model here, the entrepreneurial skills model. Learning outcomes are, for example, the entrepreneurial competencies: self-efficacy, passion, identity, uncertainty tolerance, and so on. But I mean, I would say that if you tweak your education towards more of value creation pedagogy, you don't need to tweak your learning outcomes, because the learning outcomes will be the same. It's just that the learning will be more deep. I would actually say that the less we have to change in terms of learning outcomes, the easier it would become to make our teaching or our education more entrepreneurial. Then I have this question about if a teacher can be considered entrepreneurial in his classroom when he creates something new of value to his students. And I would say that I often get this question, and teachers say, "Oh, but I'm creating value for my students." And then I would say, yeah, but that is not entrepreneurial pedagogy. I would say that in order for it to be entrepreneurial pedagogy, it is the students who have to be the ones creating value for others, because otherwise it's just a teacher doing his job. Teachers create value all the time for their students. Maybe if you do it a new way, okay, then yeah, let's talk. Then we can talk about a teacher being entrepreneurial. A teacher is creating value for his or her students in a new way. But and we need teachers to be entrepreneurial. They need to try new things. They need to learn what works with their students. But that's not entrepreneurial pedagogy. That's something else, I would say. I often hear this, that, oh, in order to get entrepreneurial pedagogy, we need to have entrepreneurial teachers. And I both agree and disagree at the same time. I think it can be misleading into making people think that it's the teacher who has to be entrepreneurial. Actually, it's the students who need to be entrepreneurial in order for us to have entrepreneurial pedagogy. And that's a much better start than thinking about what the teacher can do to be entrepreneurial towards students. Yeah. The next question, yeah, I don't fully understand. Please feel free to open up your microphone, Maria, if you want to ask or clarify. Interesting questions here, I think.
So Maria's just typing another message there. Can I say from my side, we've heard from a number of different speakers over the last week, and we've heard about about the Entrecomp framework. Is that something that you see? Someone mentioned earlier the learning outcomes. If someone needed to find learning outcomes, Entrecomp is something that could be used, could be an inspiration.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's the best framework we have for entrepreneurial competencies, and I mean, if you want to make your students develop those competencies, value creation pedagogy can be a means towards that, definitely. And if you need to put learning outcomes in your documents, which most teachers need, then I think the Entrecomp model can be absolutely a good way to. It's like a menu, and then you can pick which ones you want and so on. And I mean, the foundational work underlying Entrecomp is also quite aligned with this idea of value creation pedagogy. So it's a work material that is quite aligned with the ideas that I've been talking about here today.
Okay, we have another message coming in from Maria. Thank you.
Yeah, this is pretty condensed. I can agree on that. So it's good that it's recorded. I mean, I mean, I've been summarizing in 30 minutes, 10 years of research. So I mean, that's understandable. There is a document that I know that many people think is helpful. That's my report that I did for OECD a couple of years ago. I can just paste the link here if somebody wants to read up a little bit more about this. It comes here. I mean, I've written some more after that. It was 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, so it doesn't contain the latest ideas, but it does contain a lot of the foundation of value creation pedagogy. So that's something that I know people like.
Absolutely. I think that what Maria sort of mentioned there was looking at building a learning scenario for her students using entrepreneurial pedagogy. Martin, you shared the Entrepreneurship 360 report on the, I might not get the title completely right, the how, why, what, where, and when of entrepreneurship in education.
Yes.
An OECD report, and the link is there. It's also in one of we'll post it into the UNESCO-UNEVOC TVeT Forum as well to make sure it's there. It's in one of the posts already, but we'll do that again. Yeah. Okay, let's see if there's any more questions coming through. Maria's got another comment coming in. From my side, when we think of value, often we do think of, entrepreneurial value as being financial value, business value. You've opened this up, as many projects do around the world, to, different kinds of value. And I think it would be interesting just for you to perhaps, I know you've got a slide that is a kind of a circle of value, and one of those values is actually joy, and it might be interesting for you to explain that a little bit more. I think it's not one of the ones that you showed.
This one?
That one, yeah. Enjoyment value and influence value and harmony value, because those sometimes are not the easiest to understand sometimes, because they're not so tangible.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I can say I wrote an article that is exactly about this, so I can just paste that link as well. That article is available. It's openly available, that article, and it discusses a lot about value. But when it comes to enjoyment value, influence value, harmony value, I mean, this is a model that is a simplification of value. But I mean, enjoyment value for yourself can, of course, for example, be when you are in flow. There is this flow theory that was articulated a number of decades ago by Csikszentmihalyi. People do things just for the pure joy of it. They do it because they just like it. They get into flow. That has a value, and I have tried to label that enjoyment value. And then you have the entire entertainment industry. They are creating enjoyment value for people all the time. People pay just to feel joy, and I often see that's a great value that students can create for other people, because we are often in we are so occupationally oriented, so we think that everything that students can create value should be tangible economic value. It should be an organization that can benefit from it. But enjoyment value, you can create enjoyment value for your aunt. You can create enjoyment value for a dog. You can really broaden the perspective of how students can create value in education by having enjoyment value as something that guides you. When it comes to influence value, I would say that what we see in our studies is that it's the most powerful type of value that you can let students create, because it's kind of existential. It goes down to the purpose of life, because most people want to feel that there was a purpose that they lived. They don't want to die and nobody cares. So you want to have an influence on other people, and if you can make people feel that what they are doing is important to others, they become so motivated, and you can also help others get influence. There was this wonderful assignment where students of I think they were around 14 years old, they were asked to go to a place where homeless people got food, and to interview them and write their life stories. And that really was influence value in two levels. First, the students got to have an influence on these homeless people by caring about them. And secondly, these homeless people could tell their story to others to make an influence where their experiences became important for others. And that was a hugely powerful example of influence value, I think. Harmony value is more kind of the catch-all residual category. Whenever something isn't harmonious, we want to act upon it. It's not harmonious to destroy the planet, for example. I put ecological value in harmony value. When you act upon environmental problems, you're acting upon something that isn't harmonious. It's not social value, it's not economic value, it's not enjoyment value, it's not influence value, it's harmony value. It's kind of, let's not destroy the planet. It's so stupid. And there are a number of other examples of harmony value. So yeah, that's a short. And then I see this question: what about environmental value? Yeah, in this model, in this particular model, which is a simplification, we have to know that I put environmental value into the category of harmony value, because if it's a person acting upon the environment, that person is acting upon a disharmony in our experience. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now I have two last questions before we finish, because I think we're coming up to our hour. And obviously, let's see if there's any more questions come through the conversation. But my first question is, if you wanted to be asked a question about your work and the way about your work, what would that question be, and how would you answer it?
I mean, the most difficult question I have in this is why is this not being done already? Why do students get to spend decades in their life doing things that isn't valuable for anyone else besides themselves? Why is that happening? What kind of society do we have where we put people. It's like a mental prison for many people. You sit there and you do it. They tell you it's good for you, but you think it's the worst experience you've ever had. We have many stories about this from people with different diagnoses that go out in society and become wildly successful in life because they use these superpowers from their diagnosis to create value for others. Why don't we let people create value for others in education? I get angry when I think about this. I mean, how did we end up here, you know? Most things that students do in their education are meaningless, apart from, of course, learning, which is meaningful. But, you know, if they don't think learning is interesting for them there and then, why do we ask them to do all these meaningless things when there is a way to actually connect things that you can learn from so that it becomes also meaningful?
Absolutely.
That I don't know. You know, this question vexes me completely.
Making learning more valuable is certainly something that we need to look at, to really allow people to see the relevance of their learning to their lives and then use it, apply it in new and interesting ways. Thank you. The last question, I suppose, is, and I can kind of think that maybe we've answered it already. What would be your one takeaway for people listening to this presentation, this webinar? A concluding point that you wanted to make, but perhaps you've already made it with saying that this is what we need to improve these competencies.
And then I would say, for God's sake, or actually for our students, for our young people's sake, spread this to the people who need to hear this, so that we get more of this in education. Not for me, not for us adults, but for the kids. I have 2 kids. They are 9 and 10 years old. They don't get anything of this in their everyday schooling. And I don't know how to get my teachers or their teachers to do more of this. Please spread this so that we can, you know, to fix this goddamn problem. You know.
Thank you. Thank you. I think Maria in the comments has just said, yes, please disseminate this webinar widely. We will. We have 260 something participants from 76 countries within this conference on virtual conference on entrepreneurial learning in TVeT. And I think the ideas, the discussion and the contributions from people like Martin really bring such value to this debate. And hopefully we can all learn.
And I will follow the feedback on the conference.
Thank you so much. So I think we close there. It's been 1 hour and we really appreciate your time, Martin. We really appreciate the conversation and the insights that you've shared. And this webinar is being recorded. It will be shared on our TVeT Forum. And of course, the link will be there for you to share beyond that and for all the participants to share beyond that too. So thank you so much. Again, it's been a wonderful hour. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elin.